Are you ready to wander through the dark, gloomy streets of the Middle Ages? Yes, my dear listener, this journey won't be an easy one. But don't worry, because I, an old sage, will guide you through the depths of these dark days, shining a light along the way. Now close your eyes and imagine yourself transported back centuries to the cold, dark stone streets of Europe. People are living their lives under the shadows of fear and superstition. Science is spoken of in whispers. There's a witch around every corner, and an Inquisition court at the door of every church. In this grim atmosphere, we will witness humanity's struggle with reason and belief. The Dark Ages, this period truly lives up to its name. Across Europe, there's no science or logic, only faith and fear reign supreme. But this faith isn't the comforting kind we might think of. No, this faith is steeped in darkness, filled with witches, demons, and sorcery. People sleep at night with prayers on their lips because they're afraid. But what are they afraid of? Witches, wizards, demons, and of course the Inquisition. Throughout this video, I will take you to every corner of that dark era. We'll follow the steps of how witch hunts began, how they grew, and how ruthless they became. We'll learn how Inquisition courts operated, how people were interrogated, and how torture was inflicted. This isn't just an ordinary history lesson. This is a tale filled with darkness and mystery. Just like turning the pages of a novel, new secrets will be revealed at every turn. So here we go, my dear listeners. Let's begin. Aha! When the power of the church combined with the iron chains of feudalism, medieval Europe was truly at the mercy of its fate. When I close my eyes, I can still smell the essence of that time, the burning incense, the dim lights of the churches, the prayers of the peasants mixed with their sweat. This was not just a matter of faith. No, although the church seemed to draw its power from the heavens, its authority on earth was strong enough to shake the throne of any king. Now, let me tell you how the church and feudalism wove the very fabric of society, thread by thread. In the Middle Ages, the church was not just a religious institution, it was the greatest guardian of the political and social order. People lived under the church's watch from the moment they were born until they died. The popes of that era were not just religious leaders, they were like kings. Their words could bring kings to their knees and destroy kingdoms. All across Europe, the monasteries, cathedrals, and chapels built by the church were not just places of worship, they were shops. Everyone knew they were under the watchful eye of God and the church. Those who sinned trembled in fear of hell and sought the church's forgiveness. People calmed their fears of the afterlife through the priests of the church. But remember, the church was not just concerned with saving souls. They also controlled land, wealth, and politics. Even kings had to bow to the power of the church. Popes had a significant influence over kings. If a king fell out of favor with the church, his throne was in jeopardy. And so we can better understand how the church became a major player on the political stage, can't we? But this story isn't just about the church. There's also the massive structure of feudalism. In the Middle Ages, society was based on a strict hierarchy. At the top of feudalism were the kings and the church. Beneath them were the lords, knights, and at the very bottom, the peasants or serfs. Kings maintained their rule by distributing their lands and authority to the lords. However, within this system, each class had its own unique roles, responsibilities, and obligations. While kings were seen as God's representatives on earth, lords governed the lands on behalf of the kings. Land was everything. The more land a lord owned, the more powerful he was, and the peasants living on that land had to bow to their lords. While the peasants worked hard to make a living, they also had to stand by their lords whenever they were called to battle. Those who worked the land were actually the lowest, yet most crucial cogs in the feudal system, because this system was built upon their labor. But it was the peasants who bore the heaviest burdens. They spent their nights praying and their days toiling. They lived a life intertwined with fear, poverty, and hope. One of the most notable features of the feudal society was the absolute and rigid functioning of this hierarchical structure. No peasant, no serf could rise above their birthplace. It was a world where everyone accepted their fate, and within this hierarchical order, the power of the church overshadowed almost all other forces. In the eyes of a peasant, God and the church were the highest authority in their world. The church not only promised them salvation in the afterlife, but also maintained its existence as the guardian of order in this world. Even feudal lords couldn't make major decisions without the church's approval. So there you have it, dear listeners. A feudal system woven with the church's power had wrapped all of Europe in its web. The church's hand was beneath every stone, and the shadow of the lords lingered over every piece of land. So how would an ordinary peasant survive in this system? How would they find a way? We'll answer those questions as we continue our journey. Now take a deep breath and get ready to dive into this grim world. Before I tell you how superstitions, ancient gods, and the spirits of nature shaped life in medieval Europe, Close your eyes and feel the cold, dark atmosphere of that time. In the depths of night, people gathered in the village square, pondering what the distant howling wind and strange sounds from the forest meant. Sometimes it was the drought of a field, sometimes animals getting sick, or a child having a fever. All of it felt like a game played by unseen forces. But these forces had deep roots, remnants from times when paganism thrived and shamans communicated with spirits. Yet amidst all this, Christianity was trying to assert itself over these beliefs. This was a time when faiths clashed. Across Europe, the spirits of ancient gods filled the air. Christianity began spreading during the Roman Empire, but there was always some resistance against the teachings of this new faith. The pagan beliefs rooted in the people were intertwined with nature. It was believed that every stone and every tree had a spirit. Shamans were the mediators who communicated with these spirits. In the north, shamanism was especially strong. People living in the cold northern forest tried to understand the mystical forces behind natural events. In a world where you didn't know the cause of an illness, you would think it was a curse or the wrath of spirits. When it didn't rain, you'd believe nature was punishing you. Shamans would perform magic, communicate with spirits, and teach their communities how to protect themselves from these powers. But a great clash between these ancient beliefs and the strict teachings of Christianity was inevitable. And so Christianity took a harsh stance against the old pagan beliefs. The church claimed to be directly connected to the power of God, stating that the spiritual world operated only with God's permission. The gods of paganism were seen as masks of the devil. However, the people couldn't just abandon their old beliefs. Even if they adopted Christian teachings in their daily lives, they still continued to rely on old superstitions. This is where a strange mixture of the two worlds emerged. On one side, the church; on the other, the age-old beliefs of the people. While people prayed to God, they also kept their old rituals alive. Sometimes they'd pray to God for a good harvest, while also placing a few stones at the edge of the field to honor the spirits of nature. But one of the darkest aspects of these superstitions was the belief in witches. The fearful ghosts of the Middle Ages, they were seen as a continuation of old pagan beliefs and were cursed by the church. Especially women, with their connections to nature and the old traditions they carried in society, were incredibly vulnerable to this stigma. Healers, those who knew the healing power of plants, could suddenly be branded as witches, because these abilities were seen as the work of the devil in the eyes of the church. But remember, this was not just a perspective held by the church. It existed among the people too. Even your neighbors could accuse you of witchcraft. At first, the church's reaction to witches was pretty cautious. Initially, the church viewed the people's belief in witches as a kind of superstition and didn't take an official stance against it. Some clergymen even said, "Witches, come on." However, this period of tolerance didn't last long. As time went on, the church started to take this belief more seriously, because as Christianity spread, the battle against pagan beliefs was growing. Witches became seen as dangerous figures connected to ancient gods, so the church took action to completely eradicate these superstitions. And so it began. The dark days when witches started being seen as servants of the devil. During this time, the church's perspective hardened. Faith became a satanic conspiracy in the eyes of innocent peasants. The church decided to use this fear to control society. Witches were regarded not just as a superstition, but also as a threatening power to society. And that's how the first seeds of witch hunts were sown. The early Middle Ages were stepping into one of the darkest corners of history, where the church was at its most powerful and authoritarian. But at the same time, this was a period when ideas challenging the church's authority were also beginning to emerge. It's during this time that the seeds of the Inquisition were being sown. The Inquisition became a symbol of the church's desire not just to be a spiritual leader, but to hold absolute power, a power that would dictate beliefs and eliminate any kind of heresy in society. But how did this happen? Let's dive in step by step. In the early Middle Ages, the church's power was slowly growing and spreading across Europe. However, this expansion also brought about resistance. Imagine, while the church's teachings were presented as universal truths, a portion of the population was pushing back. Groups like the Cathars and the Bogomils were questioning the church's absolute authority and advocating for a simpler, more mystical understanding of Christianity. The Cathars were a community that emphasized spiritual purity and detachment from worldly possessions and power. They believed that the world was a material prison, and a person's soul could only be freed by escaping these material ties. The church, on the other hand, argued the exact opposite. They claimed that the material world was a gift from God, and that the church had the right to govern it. These kinds of beliefs were at the heart of the Cathar movement. This thought, which spread rapidly in the south of France, particularly in the Languedoc region, became one of the biggest challenges to the church. The Cathars believed in an eternal struggle between two opposing forces, good and evil. The world was under the influence of dark powers, and souls needed to escape this material realm. The luxurious lifestyle of the church was completely contrary to this worldview. Similarly, the Bogomils were also rebelling against the church in Bulgaria and the Balkans with a similar heresy. They believed that the relationship between the world and God was far more complex than the church's teaching suggested. These movements threatened the church's quest for absolute control, and this is why the Inquisition was born. Initially, the Inquisition acted like an investigative committee. Anyone who opposed the church's doctrines was interrogated in these new courts and accused of heresy. If you rejected the church's teachings or interpreted them differently, the Inquisition would find you, judge you, and punish you if necessary. This was a very frightening development for the time. The Inquisition was not only fighting against religious heresies but also against social unrest. The church wanted to rule not just spiritually but also politically. The real turning point came with the spread of heresies like those of the Cathars and the Bogomils. The Catharist ideology was a significant threat to the church because these beliefs were gaining acceptance not only among small communities but also among the nobility in southern France. While the Cathars promoted a simple and poor lifestyle, they criticized the church's opulent way of living. Even some nobles were sympathetic to Catharism. The church could not remain indifferent to such resistance. And this is where the Inquisition stepped it up, transforming into a true hunting machine. In the early 13th century, during the papacy of Innocent II, a crusade against the Cathars was officially launched. Yes, a crusade. Now, not only were battles being fought for the Holy Land, but any form of heresy that undermined the church's authority was also being eliminated by the sword. Soldiers sent to the Languedoc region burned and destroyed Cathar villages. Cities were captured, hundreds of people were killed, and the Inquisition began investigations everywhere to root out heresy. The Bogomils faced the same fate. This movement, which spread in the Balkans, like the Cathars, questioned the church's teachings and advocated for an alternative belief system. However, the Bogomils also came under the church's radar and got caught in the ruthless gears of the Inquisition. During this time, investigations initiated with heresy charges solidified not only the church's spiritual authority, but also its political power. Through its fight against these heretical movements, the Inquisition reinforced the church's dominance over Europe. No community, no idea could challenge the church's authority. Movements like the Cathars and the Bogomils were destroyed, and the church's power was further solidified. However, the true dark face of the Inquisition would become even more pronounced in the following centuries, marked by witch hunts and tortures. The Inquisition courts. Just thinking about those dark days still sends shivers down my spine. These courts weren't just a quest for justice, they were more like a mechanism of fear and obedience. The church set up these courts to hunt down heretics, punish the disobedient, and show everyone that it was the ultimate authority. But these courts weren't simple trial systems, no. They were much more complex and intricately designed systems of terror. Let me take you behind those cold stone walls where we can hear the whispers in the courtrooms and the pounding hearts filled with fear. The Inquisition courts were a concrete manifestation of the church's absolute authority. In these courts, not only were those who questioned their faith judged, but also those who could be questioned. The main goal wasn't just to punish heretics, but also to serve as a warning to society. The church viewed itself as God's representative on earth, and anyone who went against its will was considered a rebel not just against the church, but against God. These courts aimed to uphold God's justice. But the truth is, this sense of justice was shaped in the shadows of fear and violence. Everything began with a tip-off. The courts thrived on whispers from the streets and gossip in village squares. A neighbor's suspicious behavior, a person saying something against the faith, or even just thinking differently could catch the court's attention. That's when the charges of heresy would come, and the individual would be summoned to the Inquisition court. Defendants would embark on a long journey following this summons, but this journey usually had no return. If the Inquisition was calling someone to court, it meant the accusations were serious, and they would often find a way to prove them. So how did these courts operate? The first step was questioning the defendant. But imagine a questioning where every question is a trap and every answer could be an accusation. The defendants would try to prove their faith and loyalty. The court members were usually made up of priests, clergy, and other church officials. These members would act with determination in their fight against heresy. For them, this was not just a worldly issue, but a battle for souls. Every act of heresy was a threat to the church's authority and a danger that could plunge society into hell. That's why the Inquisition's hand was heavy, and the punishments were merciless. Most defendants were pressured to confess their crimes. If they did confess, sometimes mercy was shown, and they would be asked to submit to the church's commands. But for those who didn't confess, that's when their hellish suffering began in this world. Torture was a frequently used method during this process. Rooms where arms were stretched, skin burned, and bones cracked. The goal of torture was for the person to confess their crimes and submit to the church's truths. The church sought to save not just the body, but the soul regardless of the cost. Those who confessed would often plead for mercy and turn to the church for compassion. However, this mercy didn't always mean forgiveness. Sometimes a confession was not enough to save one's life. The punishment that followed a confession typically included imprisonment, exile, or even death. But deaths weren't swift or painless. More often than not, prisoners were burned at the stake in public squares, executed before the eyes of society. This served as both a punishment and a warning. This was the end for those who opposed the church. Although the history of these dark courts might seem like a victory for the church, the brutality and horror they left behind etched deep scars on the people. The Inquisition didn't just hunt heretics or differing beliefs, it also targeted free thought, individual liberties, and society's confidence in itself. The shadow of the Inquisition spread like a dark veil of fear, betrayal, and mistrust across every corner of Europe. Under the guise of combating heresy, the church sought to control not only beliefs but also the balance of political power. Feudal lords, kings, and even ordinary peasants had to bow down to the Inquisition's power. Ah, my dear friends, today I'm taking you on a deep journey into one of history's darkest yet fascinating periods, the witch hunts. Pay attention, because this story isn't just about witches. It's filled with societal fears, power struggles, and the darker sides of humanity. The concept of a witch has emerged as a mysterious figure lurking in the dark corridors of the past. During the depths of the Middle Ages, amid societal unrest and uncertainty, the witch became an enemy in the eyes of the people. This figure often consisted of women who lived alone, possessed unusual knowledge, and were deeply connected to nature. These women, marginalized and targeted by the desperate and powerless, were made scapegoats. Supposed witches were depicted as both innocent and dangerous, much like leaves tossed around in the midst of a storm. The accusations against witches often reflected the societal fears and unrest of the time. Events like famine, war, and disease left deep scars on the public psyche, and people turned against each other in their helplessness. In this situation, the search for a scapegoat became inevitable. Fears opened the floodgates to the witch hunts, projecting humanity's darkest feelings onto these witches. They were seen as the source of societal unrest and bad luck. The roots of witch accusations are directly tied to the church's efforts to solidify its power. The church was determined to eliminate any threats to its authority. The witch hunts were used as a tool to strengthen the church's control. Fear, like a chain that enslaved people's spirits, restricted their thoughts and actions. Witches were branded as heretics, and society began to live in fear of that label. At this point, defining what a witch was became crucial. A witch wasn't just someone practicing dark magic, they were also perceived as someone who defied societal norms. Women's pursuit of independence was viewed as a crime during this time. Freedom of thought was seen as a threat, simply because a woman had a connection with nature. This serves as an example of how women became targets in a period that fiercely protected social norms. The fear that witches instilled in society not only contributed to the church's power, but also led to the fragmentation of communities. As women became guilty in the eyes of their neighbors, families couldn't trust each other anymore. Every silence, every eye contact, every movement became a source of suspicion. The witch hunts further deepened the wounds in a society trying to learn how to live together. So what was the reality behind the witch hunts during these times? Why were people so afraid? Fear not only turned people against each other, but also shook the very fabric of society. The increase in witch hunts threatened not just the lives of women, but the overall structure of the community. In this atmosphere filled with fear, the enemy wasn't always out there, it was also a reflection of the dark feelings within people. Yes, my friends, the definitions of witches and the fears behind them were part of a decaying societal structure. We've witnessed how fear became a weapon, how it drove people apart, and most importantly, how it infiltrated our very souls. Now, are you ready to dive deeper into the witch hunts, a part of this dark chapter in our history? In upcoming sections, I'll continue to tell you how this fear grew, how witches were hunted, and what society became. Ah, my dear friends, let me take you on a deep journey into one of history's darkest periods, the rise of witch trials and the human faces behind this horrifying hunt. With every word I share, you'll be transported back to those dreadful days, feeling the atmosphere of that time like a wise elder lost in deep thought by the fire. The emergence of witch trials began like a river, flowing darkly, uncertainly, and threateningly. This tragedy wasn't just about women, it was a nightmare that involved all parts of society. It was a monster fueled by humanity's fear and ignorance. Witch hunts could spring from the smallest disagreements between neighbors or even the simplest disputes within families. A paranoia seeped through society, causing everyone to search for a common enemy. As fears grew, the dark spirit of that time targeted innocent people. On one side there was hunger, on the other disease. The series of disasters had rotted the people's spirit. Fear took such deep root that people began to fear their own shadows. This created the perfect breeding ground for witch trials. Many struggled to explain the events around them and began to point fingers at witches as the culprits for their troubles. A neighbor's failing crop became evidence of witchcraft in someone else's eyes. The emergence of witch accusations was not just a misunderstanding, it was also a manifestation of social betrayal. As communities came together to identify who might be a witch, many innocent people confessed to crimes they hadn't committed. The most brutal methods of torture were employed to force confessions from these innocent individuals. Fear became a tool of torture and oppression, easing physical pain while deepening their emotional suffering. The torture of witches was often seen by the public as a kind of spectacle. People gathered outside torture chambers, eager to hear a witch's confession. Men and women lost their bodies in these courtroom dramas, surrendering their spirits to fear and despair. Accusations were thrown around with no evidence. Even a mere rumor was treated like a court ruling. In those moments, the dark face of fear and ignorance in human history surfaced once again. Confessions during that time were like death sentences. To be called a witch meant walking a path toward death in the eyes of society. But it wasn't that simple. When someone confessed in hopes of saving themselves, it often led to accusing more witches, escalating the fear in society. Once friendly faces turned into enemies, while witches became lost amidst the chaos. Accusations continued to grow like an avalanche, engulfing the entire community. With everyone ready to blame one another, the lives of innocent people vanished one by one amidst ordinary turmoil. This terrifying phase of the witch hunts revealed humanity's deepest darkness and ruthless side. Ah, my friends, this is not just the story of witches, but also the story of humanity. It reveals how fear became a weapon, how people readied themselves to blame one another, and the helplessness lying beneath that fear. This tale, lost on the dusty shelves of history, lives on with us as a reflection of humanity's darker sides. So now, are you ready to move on to the next chapter of our story, delving deeper into this brutal period of witch hunts? Dear friends, we're about to embark on a journey to a pivotal moment in history. The plague was one of the darkest and most brutal periods of the Middle Ages, where the shadow of fear enveloped people's souls and upended entire societies. But let's dive deep into how witch accusations surged during this time and how these innocent women became scapegoats. The plague wasn't just an ordinary illness, it was like a curse that spread across the continent. Cities, villages, and every place where people interacted fell victim to this terrifying virus, and the fear of death roamed like an urban legend. In the chaos of losing loved ones one by one, everyone faced deep uncertainty. While the plague inflicted deep wounds on society, it left people in despair, creating an atmosphere of fear that hovered between life and death. This fear impacted people so profoundly that everyone began to search for a scapegoat. Unable to understand the reasons behind the disasters they faced, many turned to accusing witches. A neighbor's failing crops, another's sudden illness, or the unexpected death of a loved one became reasons to point fingers. The uncertainty brought on by the plague drove people to madness and created an atmosphere filled with irrational accusations. Women who dared to live outside societal norms, those known for their ancient wisdom, or even just those who lived differently, could easily be labeled as witches. In this era where fear and ignorance merged, even the slightest rumor could end a life. Women became symbols of not just disease but also moral decay in society. The church branded them as sinners and marginalized them, while the public was all too willing to comply. Yet these so-called witches were often the healers of their communities, known for their wisdom and connection to nature. However, as fear grew, they became targets. The plague ruthlessly devastated people while simultaneously dragging these innocent women into a dark future. Interestingly, the rise in witch accusations deeply affected not just the social structure of the time, but also the individual psyches of people. Fear eroded the trust people had in one another. Friends could turn into accusers overnight, labeling each other as witches. This process highlighted how fear and paranoia could poison human relationships. Neighbors now feared even the shadows of one another. As the plague carved deep wounds in people's hearts, witches stood out as scapegoats. Those looking to ease society's burden chose to target these innocent women, thinking it would provide relief. Yet pointing fingers at witches marked a societal decay and revealed humanity's darkest sides. A society held captive by fear and ignorance projected its inner anxieties onto witches. Dear friends, in this chapter of history, humanity had lost itself in the dark maze it had created. Using witches as scapegoats became a symbol of fear and ignorance, while also serving as a warning for the future of society. Now, let's move on to the next section to explore the depths of this dark period and uncover how witch hunts continued. These stories, buried in the dusty shelves of history, may hold lessons that we should never forget. Dear friends, I'm about to take you on a dark and mysterious journey. After the fear created by the plague and the rise in witch accusations, we reach a turning point, the emergence of Malleus Maleficarum, or the witch hammer. This work will lay the groundwork for the rise of witch hunters and deepen societal fears even further. In 1487, two Dominican priests, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, penned this horrifying pamphlet. It detailed how to identify witches, how to capture them, and how to deal with them. Of course, this book was not just a guide, it was also a propaganda tool designed to instill fear in society. The witch hammer became the most significant manifesto for hunting witches. The text contained numerous claims about what a witch should look like, what witches could do, and what rituals they performed. Malleus Maleficarum even defined various traits that made it easier to label certain women as witches, with the belief that women possess supernatural powers leading the list. This fueled deep gender inequality in society and demonized women. Just think about it, dear viewers. This book had such an impact that it legitimized witch hunts in the Christian world. It laid the groundwork for witch hunters to be seen as heroes, allowing them to secure their place in society. Witch hunters were now not just hunters, they were viewed as holy warriors in the eyes of the public. Malleus Maleficarum became a symbol of fear, ignorance, and dogma. Meanwhile, another conflict was brewing in the depths of history, the Protestant Reformation. Beginning in the mid-16th century under figures like Martin Luther, this movement was a rebellion against the authority of the Catholic Church. As this conflict caused a significant division in the Christian world, it also deeply affected the witch hunts. While Protestant reformers were critically questioning their beliefs, witch hunters expertly manipulated the chaos to their advantage. Although Protestants adopted the Catholic Church's perspective on witches, they created a different perception of witchcraft within their own belief system. They intensified the pressure on women, labeling them as enemies of both society and faith. In the clash between the church and witch hunters, witches again became scapegoats. Thus, the conflict between the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Church further expanded the dimensions of witch hunts, deepening the atmosphere of fear and ignorance. A horrific, vicious cycle emerged. As witch hunters captured more witches, the fear in society only grew. People began to develop a paranoid attitude not just towards witches, but towards every individual caught in the conflict. Witches became symbols of spiritual and social upheaval, and both sides shamelessly exploited the situation for their own gain. In summary, Malleus Maleficarum and the witch hunts it inspired opened deep wounds in society as a reflection of the conflict between the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Church. While people continued to live under the grip of fear, innocent women became victims of this fear, bearing the mark of witchcraft. This is why stepping back into historical processes reveals the interconnectedness that leads us to a dark reality. Dear friends, I now invite you to the next chapter of this dark journey. We will explore in greater depth how the witch hunts continued and the types of suffering they inflicted on people. Remember, history always contains a lesson, and perhaps this dark period serves as a warning that should never be repeated. Dear friends, I'm about to take you on another journey to a significant turning point in history. The witch trials in continental Europe and Britain were not just a struggle for justice, they were also the product of deep belief conflicts, societal fears, and ignorance. During this time, witch hunts became weapons in the battles between Protestant and Catholic churches, turning societies into dark mazes. Think about it. The 16th and 17th centuries were some of the peak times for witch hunts across many parts of Europe. In countries like Germany, France, and Italy, accusations against witches grew like an avalanche. People were driven to accuse their neighbors and betray old friends because they feared being labeled as witches themselves. That's when an environment dominated by fear, paranoia, and mistrust was born. One of the hotspots for witch hunts was the northern regions of Germany. In the 1620s, accusations flew left and right. While governments turned a blind eye to the violent actions of witch hunters, many innocent people lost their lives due to nothing more than their neighbors' hostility. Women thought to be connected to evil spirits were often those who were disabled, elderly, or marginalized. Their identities were easily exploited to create animosity and fear within the community. In Britain, things took a different turn. Witch hunts intensified, especially between 1645 and 1647 in the eastern regions of England. This period, marked by the capture and conviction of witches, was also filled with chaos and confusion due to the ongoing civil war. The conflicts between Protestant and Catholic communities became a battleground for witch hunts. Fears led both sides to accuse one another, essentially organizing witch hunts to clear their own names. While the Protestant Church criticized the oppressive structure of the Catholic Church, they also used witch hunts as a tool to strengthen their own power. Although Protestants enacted strict laws to legitimize witch hunts, these hunts acted more like shields to cover up social injustices and unrest in society. People targeted others to prove their own innocence and avoid betrayal by their neighbors. During this process, witch hunters wielded the community's fears like a weapon, strengthening both themselves and the church. It wasn't just personal interests at play, religious and political goals also came into the mix. Witch hunts had a broad impact on the Christian world and played a decisive role in the conflict between the two sides. At the same time, while witch hunts were gaining momentum, some rational voices began to rise up against this tyranny. Gradually, the truth that witch hunts were tools for fostering fear and ignorance rather than achieving justice started to be accepted. As people questioned the fears and pains they were experiencing, they began to criticize the attitudes of both churches. In conclusion, the witch trials in continental Europe and Britain shaped themselves as reflections of religious wars and social conflicts. These events left deep scars on both individuals and societies. In an era filled with fear and paranoia, society experienced a great contradiction within itself, resulting in the ruin of innocence and the darkening of lives. Now, dear friends, as we continue on this dark journey, let's move on to the next chapter to explore the consequences of witch hunts and the deep marks this tragedy left behind. Remember, history isn't just a record of the past, it's a teacher that shapes our future. Ah, Salem, a place that starkly reveals humanity's fears and ignorance even in the New World. Let me take you back to 17th century America, specifically to what we now know as Massachusetts. The echoes of the Salem witch trials weren't just a shadow over one town, they were a haunting reflection of fear, justice, and the twisted sense of morality that enveloped the entire New World. Salem illustrates how the fear of witch hunts didn't stay confined to Europe, but spread across continents, showing how the deepest fears of the human soul took root in new lands. So let's dive into this dark story. In 1692, things kicked off in Salem when some young girls started behaving strangely. Suddenly, these girls were having weird fits, fainting, and screaming uncontrollably. People started to think there must be a reason behind this odd behavior: witchcraft. The townsfolk quickly jumped to the conclusion that this bizarre situation was caused by witchery. Once the fear of witchcraft spread in Salem, it became a wildfire that couldn't be contained. That initial spark quickly turned into hysteria that left the town in flames. Back then, the people of Salem were tightly bound to their religious beliefs, viewing anything contrary to God's decrees as a significant threat. Imagine, in these new lands, Christianity served as a strong shield, a beacon of hope, and a guiding light. But ignorance, distrust, and social fear only deepened under the shadow of that religious shield. Things spiraled so out of control in Salem that people didn't hesitate to accuse their neighbors, relatives, and even family members of being witches. Why was that? Salem was a town rife with economic and social tensions. Agriculture, trade, and land disputes had already created a tense atmosphere. Everyone was deeply suspicious of each other. Accusing someone of witchcraft became an effective way to maintain one's position and eliminate enemies. People started using witch accusations like weapons at the slightest disagreement or discomfort. When the trials began, the Salem courts quickly took these accusations seriously. Courts were set up, and those accused of witchcraft were put on trial. The atmosphere in the courtrooms was chilling. It felt like everyone had turned into hunters seeking out witches. The accused were often poor, marginalized women, or those who simply didn't fit in with the community. But the true horror of the Salem trials was how quickly these accusations spiraled out of control. When someone was accused, they were tortured to confess. Most of the accused couldn't prove their innocence. Being labeled a witch was almost like a death sentence. Many of those tried for witchcraft in Salem confessed under torture. People who were convinced they were witches faced horrifying accusations. Those who claimed, "I made a pact with the devil," often had to say that under duress. Sadly, confessing didn't save their lives, quite the opposite, as those who confessed frequently found themselves at the gallows. These tragic trials led to a kind of collective hysteria, and Salem people began to accept their nightmares as reality, accusing others before the finger pointed at them. Neighbors turned against each other, families were torn apart, and friendships vanished. This hysteria only led to more witches being uncovered and the hunt gaining momentum. As accusations rose rapidly, no one felt safe. So where did all this turmoil come from? The colonies that migrated from Europe brought not only their beliefs but also their old world fears with them. The shadows of witch trials in Europe had reached the New World. Disputes between different Christian denominations were also evident in the New World. The conflicts between Protestant and Catholic groups fueled the witch hunts both in Europe and America. Salem stood out as the harshest example of this conflict in the New World. The people of Salem grew up under the shadow of the witch hunts in Europe, and that shadow turned their lives into a living hell. However, this wave of hysteria in Salem didn't last long. The trials had such tragic consequences that people finally began to see the truth. After hundreds of innocent lives were lost and dozens were unjustly executed, the town's leaders took action to put an end to this dark chapter. The conclusion of the Salem witch trials marked the closing of this dark page in history, but the scars of pain and fear it left behind would never be erased. Ah, my friends, this was the most tragic reflection of the witch hunts in America. What happened in Salem is not just the story of one town, but a testament to how fragile humanity can be and how ruthless it can become in the face of its fears. Yet wisdom lies in learning the lessons from these dark days. The greatest lesson Salem teaches us is how easily ignorance and fear can turn people into hunters. Now, as we slowly step away from this dark page of history, let's take a moment to reflect on what lessons these events might hold. In the next chapter, we'll discuss how the witch hunts came to an end and what changes unfolded after this tragedy. The Age of Enlightenment, my friends. A time when humanity slowly broke free from the dark chains of ignorance and began to walk toward the light of science. Ah, yes. This period needs to be described as if you lived through it yourself. For until then, new ideas were just starting to sprout in a world filled with oppression, fear, and ignorance. Minds that had been crushed under the dominance of the church for centuries were now beginning to question, understand, and learn what freedom truly meant. Imagine a time when the church's once unshakable power was finally being challenged. After years spent under the dark shadow of the Inquisition, science and reason were finally coming to the forefront. The Inquisition had been a weapon in the hands of the church for centuries, used to silence those labeled as heretics. Over time, these courts had become the biggest symbol of the church's power. But the Age of Enlightenment was a time when people dared to question and even break this power. Starting from the late 17th century, scientific thought began to spread rapidly across Europe. It was a time when Galileo was using his telescope to study the heavens, and Newton was formulating the law of gravity. The world could no longer be explained by old dogmas. Science didn't just help us understand natural phenomena. It became a tool for questioning humanity's place, its relationship with God, and social order. People, once surrounded by the church's absolute authority, were now trying to understand the universe through reason and observation. Of course, this wasn't easy. The church didn't want to lose the power it had held for centuries. At first, they tried to suppress these new ideas and judge scientists. Many, like Galileo, found themselves caught in the clutches of the Inquisition. The church clung tightly to the old belief that the earth was the center of the universe. But my friends, no matter how much one tries to suppress the truth, it must eventually come to light. Standing against science was like trying to block a flowing river. The water always finds a new path and continues to flow. This flow began to weaken the church's power. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke, who were the greatest minds of the Enlightenment, became advocates not just for science but also for individual freedom. These thinkers argued that while questioning the church's authority, people needed to use their own minds to understand the world. This movement, led by reason and science, ultimately brought about the end of the Inquisition. People began to think not out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire to seek the truth and for the common good of humanity. And the church, once at the center of every decision, guiding kings and emperors, slowly began to lose its power against this new wave of thought. Even popes, bishops, and Inquisition judges realized they could no longer stand against science and reason. The Inquisition started to fade away like a ghost in the face of people's belief in freedom of thought and conscience. The Inquisition courts may have closed, but this was not just the end of a court. It marked the closing of an era. The church's absolute power now struggled to survive solely in the religious realm, but it no longer held authority in politics, science, and society. People could think more freely and question more boldly. Seeing the system they had been fed by ignorance and fear for centuries gradually crumble was a great awakening for them. But did this change only affect the church? Certainly not. A revolutionary wave swept through all segments of society. People learned to live not just by God's commandments but also by their own reason. This brought about a questioning of not only religious authority, but also social authority. The feudal system, aristocratic privileges, monarchical regimes, all were shaken by this new thought brought by the Enlightenment. During this period, Europe experienced significant social changes. The French Revolution and the American War of Independence were driven by the fundamental motivations of individual rights, freedom, and reason that the Enlightenment taught people. The Church could no longer resist these changes. The dark days of the Inquisition were behind, and the doors to a new era were opening. This was an era where science and freedom prevailed, and people determined their own destinies. Now, my friends, as we look back, what was the biggest lesson of the Enlightenment? Knowledge always triumphs over ignorance. Reason is stronger than fear. And most importantly, once you begin to question, that path always leads to greater freedoms. No matter how powerful the Inquisition was, it could not stand against reason. The Age of Enlightenment marked the end of this dark chapter in history. Yet this end was also the beginning of humanity's rebirth. And so it goes. The end of the Inquisition sealed with the victory of reason and science. But my friends, this victory shouldn't remain only in history books. We must remember it every day, using our minds to stand against ignorance and fear. Because history only teaches us its greatest lessons in this way. In the next section, I'll talk about how the changes brought by the Enlightenment shaped the world, how societies were reborn, and how we continue to trace the footprints of this revolution. As we gather around the fire again, my friends, let's dive deep into the recesses of our minds. The history of humanity, which changes, evolves, and grows over time, tells each of us a different story. Every era carries its own darkness and light. On our journey from the Dark Ages to the Age of Enlightenment, it is our duty to keep these stories alive and not forget them. Let's remember that every era takes its place on the stage of history thanks to the courage, determination, and questioning spirit of the people. For centuries, those seeking the light of knowledge have fought against the chains of darkness. This struggle continues in today's world as well. We must still stand up for our values regarding knowledge, freedom, and humanity, because history reminds us that even in places dominated by darkness, there is always a glimmer of hope. In the years to come, the rise of scientific thought began to shake the stronghold of the Church. The cold, harsh judgments of the Inquisition were replaced by a quest for the spread of free thought. The desire to explore the human mind, nature, and the secrets of the universe opened new doors at this turning point in history. And we must understand the wisdom passed down from the past during this process. Every day we face new information and new questions. In this context, history hasn't just stayed within the pages of textbooks, it has found its place in every aspect of our lives. The witch hunts and the Inquisition were not just a period. They also represent a deep investigation into the darkness of the human spirit. Humanity has faced many dangers throughout history and has often been a slave to fear. However, those who acted with courage and reason have always been a step ahead. Now, as we reach the end of this journey, I want to remind you once again to always question, learn, and draw lessons from the traces of the past. This journey into history should not be limited to the past. It should also serve as a guide for shaping your future. For now, I'll wrap things up here, my friends. But remember, this story doesn't end here. Each of you is a hero who will rewrite what has been told in your own life. History is not just a collection of events, it is also a summary of the lessons we learn from those events. I hope to see you in new adventures and new stories. Until then, take care.